This is exactly what they are doing, and they're doing it to hide. And they find places to hide after an inflammation or an acute infection has occurred. They are semi-dormant, so they don't scare people. There's not a lot of inflammation. It's slowly evolving, and then it can later on cause infections.
Public health. It's on everyone's mind these days, from hand washing to emerging pathogens. Welcome to Transmission Control, an infection prevention podcast focused on your appetite for trailblazing thought, discussion, and innovations that will help you make informed decisions. Each episode, we speak with public health experts and safety champions from across the globe as they share their experiences, passion, and opinions. From investigative journalism to medical publications, we tackle real-world barriers to halting the spread of disease. Whether you are tuning in for education, inspiration, or to hear the stories that need to be told, thank you for joining us. And now, get ready to blast off with your weekly injection of insight on transmission control.
This week on Transmission Control, we speak with Wava Truscott, president of Truscott MedSci Associates, LLC. So, Larry, I'm really excited to talk to Wava today because I know everybody is keenly aware of bacteria, viruses, really anything that maybe presents an infection challenge, especially with such heightened awareness these days. But I'm not sure that everybody understands the evolution of bacteria and how it's gotten stronger and how it continues to adapt and under what conditions that has happened. And so I'm really excited not only to talk to Wava today about that background, but also what are the real world implications for all of us in the healthcare industry, no matter the setting, whether it's an acute hospital setting or we're talking surgery centers or long-term care, just from a very global perspective, what are the risks that are still ahead of us and how well have we been responding to that and how prepared are we for what may be coming in the future?
Right, and I'm sure she will talk about biofilms, like the type that form on implants in the body, and then the biofilms that form on the internal channels of reusable medical devices. Both are biofilms, and one might have to be removed surgically in the case of a biofilm on an implant, while the other one is ideally removed with a cleaning brush. So there's a lot of crossover between central supply and surgery and biofilms and how they form and how we can prevent them. So I'm very interested to hear about the evolution of bacteria and their formation of biofilms and what we need to do next to improve public health.
All right, let's get right into it with Wava Truscott, president of Truscott MedSci Associates, LLC, after a short break. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Dr. Lawrence Muscarella.
From 17 Studios, let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Joining us now is Wava Truscott, president of Truscott MedSci Associates, LLC. And Wava, we know each other pretty well. We've presented at a couple of conferences together, and I've seen you speak about biofilms extensively in the sterile processing realm. And I've also watched a number of your webinars and presentations, and quite honestly, honored to have you on this episode of Transmission Control today to really talk about how bacteria survive, some of the techniques they use to survive, and what that means for all of us in the healthcare industry. And really nobody better to join us and talk about this today. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity. Looking forward to speaking about I love the bugs.
Well, I think by the time we're done this podcast, nobody is going to love the bugs. I think they're going to be just extra specially scared. But let's set the table and have this conversation about bacterial survival. And I've heard you describe this concept of the universal prime directive. Can you tell us what that is?
Yes, all living things, whether it's a bug, whether it's a human, whether it's a microbe, have a prime directive, and that's that instinctive will, that instinctive pressure to survive. You survive for the individual itself, or the individual bacterium in this case, survival of their children or family, and then survival of the species itself. Whatever it takes to stay alive. And we will invent things, or we have it innately.
You know, Wava, before we get started, I'm curious if you could comment a little bit or educate me a little bit on when we understand Darwinism, that with the rate at which bacteria divide, and with the way bacteria have been around for so long, it's amazing that bacteria are still, at least some of them, susceptible to our immune system. This seems pretty remarkable to me, that bacteria have not completely defied all attempts by us to destroy them and be just universally resistant. Why do you think that hasn't happened yet? We certainly see it happening with the antibiotic-resistant bugs, but I'm curious of your thoughts of why bacteria, at least some of them, still remain susceptible to antibiotics, if not to our own defenses.
A very good question. And just like humans, there are things that we adapt to. But first of all, going back to the bacteria, just like humans, have a certain amount of energy, certain amount of memory in their DNA and everything else. If you can picture some bacteria species that have evolved, initially they were very resistant to heat. And then it turns out that they are in a situation of climate changing, being moved on ships, if you will, from one continent to another. And they no longer need that resistance anymore because they aren't exposed to the heat. At that point, basically that portion of the DNA is shut off because it's using too much energy. So then they turn around and adapt to other things that they have in their environment. Now, what happens when they are exposed to antibiotics? Well, they've never seen it before, so just as you're saying, they develop a resistance to it. And different bacteria are resistant in different ways. But then it goes away, or they meet one of their relatives, if you will, that have never been exposed, and for a while that's turned off, but it can be turned on again. And as we get into biofilm, we'll have several examples of how that is regained in the population.
And so before we get to biofilms, you're kind of referring to something that's always interested me that I've never understood, is the DNA that can be turned on and turned off. It's kind of like a wizard behind a curtain that is kind of turning this on. What causes DNA? Is it environmental stressors and other factors? What causes the portion of the DNA to turn on and then ultimately produce a protein or an enzyme that might then dismantle the antibiotic? What is controlling the DNA? What's behind the DNA?
A big part of that is just survival. You have various mutations in the DNA that occur that don't help the bacteria at all. Other cases, they help and they're very successful and they survive. However, there may have been a million other bacteria that have had various alterations in their DNA that weren't able to meet that challenge and all died.
I see. So this could be kind of like a statistical phenomenon, if you will.
That is correct. Very much so, in fact. And then once it is expressed and used, but no longer challenged, it is put to the back, basically, so that the rest of the DNA or the energy within the bacterium itself is no longer needed to keep that going. That allows the bacteria then not to need as much energy, not as much food. It's less stressful.
So what would be the process then? We have a biofilm that's forming, let's say, on an artificial heart valve. The biofilm forms. And I'd like to better understand for myself whether there are any differences between that biofilm that's forming on the artificial heart valve or maybe a biofilm that's forming on the internal channel of an endoscope. Are these all kind of the same? And is the biofilm's production tying back a little bit to this issue of DNA and the DNA being turned on or it's turned off, and then it ends up producing these proteins and these other compounds that then make the biofilm so resistant?
Yes, the basic formation of the biofilm and the 5 stages it goes through are the same, both outside of the body and as well as inside of the body. At that point, there are so many mechanisms within a biofilm, such as shooting out some of its RNA and its DNA into the goo of the matrix so that other bacteria can grab it and they start to then have the resistance, let's say, to the antibiotics. There's a whole different electronic change on the outer surface of the biofilm, both for those that are outside the body as well as inside the body, that as the antibiotic comes, it repels it. There's other mechanisms inside in both situations that they accept the antibiotic in, and then they shoot it out again, constantly defeating the antibiotic. There's another where it comes through the goo, and if you can picture the goo, or if you put something like a dye in there, you'd see it getting lighter and lighter and lighter as it's diluted. And it's so weak at the end that it hits a bacterium, and the bacterium says, oh, here it comes, here's the antibiotic, and it has time then to go ahead and start to express itself and be defensive. Also the biofilm, and they actually communicate to make multiple targets. The antibiotic finally gets down there, it's diluted, it tries to kill the target, another target comes into play, so it never destroys all the bacteria. So all the things I just explained are happening both on a heart valve as well as they would be out in a stream.
So are you kind of saying you're robbing Peter to pay Paul in a way?
Yes, or at least putting Paul to sleep.
Which has some benefits.
Yeah.
And, what you're describing is really this way that as we kicked all of this off, that bacteria survive, right? How do they adapt to their circumstances and their environments as well? And so I thought maybe from a higher level, you could talk about what kinds of threats have challenged bacteria over the years, because I realize they've been around for over 3.5 billion years. And then I'd like to go from there and talk about how they've responded and adjusted to those conditions and how that makes them stronger. So what kinds of things over that 3.5 billion years have caused them to become more resilient and adapt?
Sure. So many things before humans ever came into the environment. In fact, as you said, 3.5 billion years bacteria have been around, where man has only been around between 5 and 7 million years. Okay, so during that early time, there were volcanoes. Initially, they were in the ocean. Let's say the lava comes down, it heats it up, the water starts to dry out. These bacteria then are in a very, very concentrated salty area. So some of them will adjust to the salt conditions. Others, rains come down. It's acidic because of the ash from the volcanoes. So they learn to survive both in the clear without the salt because it's been washed away for these particular individuals, and they're dried out and they're doing just fine. And then you take it to something in Yellowstone. Yellowstone in the United States, the park is just an amazing place to see all the environments that different. They live in boiling pools. They live in mud. They live deep in the earth. They live in the air. And they have, just as we talked about before, millions and billions and trillions of them have died, but one or two survived and then started to have kids, basically, with these new genetic defenses for that particular environment.
Did the bacteria that form the endospores, the Clostridium difficile, those that form those spores, that dormant state of hibernation, is that a Darwinian evolutionary kind of process? Were they always vegetative and susceptible and then evolved into the spore-forming kind of bacteria? And they kind of, through evolution, these spores then grew this shell, if you will, to protect them from adverse conditions. Were they always like that? Or was this something that evolved because of the environmental stresses?
In other words, the chicken or the egg first,
Exactly.
Right? It would have to be, they would be in their normal state, challenge, and then start to have each of the different levels. They actually have, in the almost like a golf ball as a spore, they have 5 or 6 layers. I'm sure, although we really don't know, we weren't there back then, but each of the layers have become more protective. One of them more for heat, one more for pressure, and it's just, so you start off as a normal bacterium, and then those two groups of bacteria have developed the spore form.
And why do you think a bacterium like, let's say, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, that's an organism that has become resistant to some first, second generation antibiotics? So
Yes.
From a chemical standpoint, those bacteria have mutated and become resistant. But why might they not have grown their own shell or golf ball that you call it? Why would they not have evolved into spore-forming bacteria? Why remain vegetative? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Perhaps it is the type of threat they had at the time, but it's just, like you said before, it's statistical. Something they tried, maybe that was somebody, the Bacillus and Clostridia tried spores first before they tried the other things. Pseudomonas is such a moisture, it is really an aggressive organism. Its aggressiveness is almost part of its defense.
Interesting. So maybe in another millennia, Pseudomonas will also be spore-forming bacteria. Time will tell.
It certainly could happen.
Interesting. I thought there'd be a really good tie-in for your central supply people, is that the biofilms that are forming on the surfaces that have become antibiotic resistant, and that as Wava said, the antibiotic then becomes diluted. It's a similar situation where the bacteria are remaining on instruments that aren't necessarily being cleaned immediately after the procedure. So so it's almost as if I'm trying to tie in the biofilm and its antibiotic resistance in time to the biofilm in time staying on the surface of an instrument, and then while not resistant to antibiotics per se, can become resistant to a brush.
Larry, on that, you said on the brush, boiling it down, your question is it going to form on the brush because it's not being kept warm or it's being hung up or what?
No, so there's this whole logistic and expense issue where the instruments that are supposed to be reprocessed promptly after the procedure, the endoscopes, may not be because limited staff, particularly with COVID. So the protein, the blood, the organic debris is remaining on the instrument. It may not be removed. So as time goes on and it hardens, it's becoming resistant to removal by the cleaning brush, staying on the internal lumen of the instrument.
Larry, you're absolutely correct. The situations where things have happened so that we're not immediately keeping those products moist, removing the food from the instruments themselves, are encouraging more and more the biofilm formation. Then as they're sitting there and you've actually had a biofilm forming, everything dries out, all the food and everything else, but it's trapped under the biofilm. And the brush that you would normally be able to wipe it off, as long as it had been kept moist, can no longer dislodge it. In fact, at that stage, let's pretend that is exactly what has happened. Everything now is cleaned out around it, but they've missed everything that was underneath the biofilm. When that goes into the sterilizer, it does not kill the organisms within. It actually starts to treat the biofilm. Maybe they've got a little bit of moisture around it from the steam. Then it dries out, and the heat has even affected it more. We now have a whole new stage of the biofilm. It's called a stage 6 instead of just the 5 stages. And that stage 6 is ever more difficult than even the dried on biofilm, because now that it's been sterilized, it's almost lacquered it in place.
So, Wava, what that's teaching us then is something that we've known, but it's really worth underscoring and highlighting here now, in that when guidelines say promptly reprocess the instrument, the endoscope, the surgical instrument, we really want to underscore the importance of not allowing the instrument to just sit. And people are very busy and don't have the time necessarily to immediately address a soiled instrument, but we just want to make the listeners cognizant of the fact that this is really important, that the longer that instrument sits, the more resistant it becomes to the cleaning brush, just like through evolution, the bacteria can become more and more resistant to the antibiotic.
You're absolutely correct. And so taking that one step further, Larry, is that, okay, I don't have time. I don't have time to actually do the flushing appropriately and all that. Keeping it moist, just getting the fluid in there and getting the moisture around it, even if it's on a wet towel that's put over it, in some way makes all the difference in the world in the ability of that brush to be successful in removing the biofilm.
So what someone might think was an insignificant step actually is a very important step to prevent the formation of that biofilm, or at least to prevent the formed biofilm from hardening and then being transmitted from one patient to the next. So that's an excellent point that you've made.
That you have as well. And yes, that's extremely, extremely important.
So these are some great examples of how bacteria is learning to survive in the now. But the other thing that's kind of scary that you've mentioned to me before, Wava, is that bacteria can also kind of lie dormant in certain conditions and present a problem. And I think you just compared our lifespan to bacteria's lifespan a few moments ago, that there could be bacteria that preceded human existence that could have been formed and could potentially still be lingering in our environment, but in a dormant state. Could you talk about that and how that might present a future risk?
Yes, there are actually groups now that are researching that deeply, partly because NASA was doing some work in the permafrost area, and they recovered soil that had been frozen since 32,000 years ago. That's about the time of the saber-toothed tiger. And as they did so and brought it out, they were able to actually cultivate organisms that had been frozen all that time, and they swam around. We've never identified that species before, so it is from the past. It's not something that's been contaminated. We don't know if that would be infectious, but it is possible that other things, that whether it's talking about Yersinia pestis with bubonic plague or something like that, could certainly be something that would threaten us as far as pandemics.
So it could be infectious, and it could exist, and it could also evolve again under new circumstances in the environment. Yes,
that's absolutely true. In fact, one of those examples is for anthrax. In the permafrost that thawed up in Siberia, some of the anthrax spores, in this case, were released, and it killed one 12-year-old child. However, it also killed 2,300 reindeer. So that's an example of what could happen with an infectious organism that thaws.
And nobody wants to hear about how bacteria and viruses can jump from one species to another right now.
Exactly. We have so many examples like Ebola and others, and HIV, from bats to monkeys to humans or pangolins or whatever new host is needed to survive. It's that prime directive. You got to survive.
So how do we drive the software then in hospitals and medical facilities that are looking to, during their surveillance, detect infections that maybe are from unfamiliar? They've come from another country. Maybe they're not indigenous to facilities in the United States, or maybe they're rarely encountered. How do we assure that the software and staff are picking up on them and detecting them, surveilling thoroughly, and that we're not getting these variants that are kind of evolving, staying under the radar, and so we have people getting infected by otherwise unique and rare organisms that we probably should be aware of, but the software is not detecting them. What can we do to ensure that we start capturing these unfamiliar organisms?
It's a very good point, Larry, and truly it has made a huge difference to have the software to be able to track things, and it has been a tremendous help in understanding the world. However, there will always be variants. There will always be those few that survived in a tough area and have become different bacteria, if you will, or viruses. And I think it's that next level of software. It's got to be the artificial intelligence is going to say, this is a freak. Something's wrong here. Let's send it to CDC. And so that sample needs to be sent and analyzed more deeply.
So that the surveillance would become more sensitive. It would detect this strain or this variant. It would flag it. And then the policy and procedure would dictate what would be done next, for example, to send to the local, state, or federal Department of Health.
Yes, that's correct. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, excellent.
So let's bring it back to some real practical implications. We've talked a lot already about surgical procedures at acute setting in hospitals, but especially very recently, I think we're learning a lot of lessons in long-term care, nursing homes, and in some cases we might have been caught quite unaware. And we know that this bacteria is going to continue to evolve. So maybe we've learned some lessons, but how do we as healthcare, especially in vulnerable populations, in different settings that are not as acute and maybe don't have as much sterile environment involved in controlling that environment, how should or how will those environments continue to be challenged, and how should they adapt?
And following up on that, Justin, how should these facilities evolve? For example, might they have to have a wing that allows for cohorting and for the contact precautions or airborne precautions for these next viruses or the next pandemic that may come down the road? Just like the bacteria, how should these long-term care facilities be evolving to adapt and protect all of us?
Gentlemen, both excellent questions and thought processes. And unfortunately, this is a problem we have had for many years, and we have basically ignored that. Now, as we have an aging population, this becomes even more and more to the front, if you will. What has really highlighted, as Larry was saying, is the recent time that we have had with COVID. It is something that is going to take a large amount of effort and education
And money.
And money, you're absolutely correct. A significant amount of money to upgrade and to realize how important it is. People have lived a long time. They've done so many things to build our nation and our world to heights that we are at now. We owe them that opportunity to get rid of their infections. And needless to say, the aging body is probably half as effective as it used to be as far as fighting off infections, so making them ever so much more vulnerable. The skill level of the workers, and this is not to put them down because they're working their hearts out, it's they just have not been given that opportunity to learn and the resources to use the proper equipment and the proper medications and procedures. So to your point, yes, I think that we need to have, first of all, the education. Then just having the money to be able to do the separation, it would be extremely important. Going to isolation facilities definitely would be awesome. I'm not sure that every facility will be able to do that, but we need to have places in our hospitals who are very skilled at that or have the equipment, the expensive equipment to do so, or need to make a space for those who are extremely vulnerable.
And I could tell you, having worked as a nursing assistant and as a registered nurse in long-term care settings, that there are some other general challenges, even just staffing model, staffing turnover, a lot of the new CNAs that come out of school, they're just taking that job as a stepping stone to get into an acute setting. And so sometimes the experience level, just by virtue of the environment, can be impacted as well. I'm not going to say that that's across the board, but there's also, some just general structural challenges in how we manage those facilities across the country.
So this is a sensitive issue, but the CDC was slow to conclude that the COVID-19 virus was airborne. It seemed almost when it first started, it was contact precautions and droplet precautions that we would apply. Let's say another pandemic comes down the road in another 100 years, one that apparently is transmitted by the airborne route. How would long-term care facilities have to be designed in order to be able to preemptively protect the patient so that an airborne virus would not be transmitted from one patient on one hall to the next patient down at the end of the other hall?
Larry, that's an excellent point and a very important point, and I think a very realistic point. And part of it is going to be earlier. We said there's going to have to be an increase in finances in order to fund things. And if you think about all the advances there have been recently in the last 10 years or 15 years in HEPA filtration and affordable filtration, I think that's going to be one of the main things that we do is let's start at least giving them clean air in the first place to at least dilute and capture some of potential airborne. From there, you go into more of the isolations so that the rooms are built such that they really could be isolates of themselves, as well as having, of course, the air filtration.
For example, like a negative room pressure?
Absolutely.
And air exchanges, which became a major focus for the airlines over the last several months.
And, they talked about it before, and that's a good point, Justin, because they did talk about that before, saying they were doing a better job. Obviously, they didn't if they're advertising how well they're doing now as far as improving the filtration. However, to the earlier point, we are now in a better place to be able to do this, and not as the level of expense it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of the marketing around that was tying it to the same types of air exchanges you would experience in an operating room. So raising that bar in terms of air quality, I think is maybe something we'll see not only in healthcare, but across many industries because the awareness of it has gotten so great.
And maybe in the future when we encounter a respiratory virus, we might conclude initially that it is transmitted by the airborne route and then seek to rule that out, but to implement as best as we can engineering controls that address that right up front and immediately, rather than potentially concluding it's only transmitted by contact route or maybe by the droplet route within a 6-foot range. Maybe when moving forward, we'll assume it is airborne and then work from there, and we can always work backwards and then scale down. It's harder to scale up as time goes on.
Proactive versus reactive.
Exactly.
For sure.
Exactly.
So, Wava, one of the things as we wrap up this interview that you had kind of put on our radar as a key takeaway and an underreported or underdiscussed topic, and we're really going to end on this one, but small colony variants. And so why is this not getting as much attention as it should? And what is the concern here? Help us characterize that.
I'm very concerned about small colony variants. These are organisms such as Staphylococcus, MRSA has small colony variants, vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus, E. coli, Pseudomonas. So there are probably about 8 different individual pathogens that have small colony variants. So what the heck is that? These are organisms that instead of looking like a Staphylococcus, they are 1/10 the size, number one. Number two, their coagulase is turned off. Everything that you would use to identify a Staphylococcus is not present. It's turned off. Larry, you and I were talking earlier about turning off the DNA. This is exactly what they are doing, and they're doing it to hide. And they find places to hide after an inflammation or an acute infection has occurred. They are semi-dormant, so they don't scare people. There's not a lot of inflammation. It's slowly evolving, and then it can later on cause infections. But why I was so concerned about it, Justin, is that we aren't identifying it because the diagnostics have to be quite different. They have to extend for weeks rather than 1 week. They, like I say, you can't use the stick and the normal way you would just say, oh, that's a Staph aureus, because it's changed its identity so much. So we need to devote time to look at all of our diagnostics, because without that, how the heck do you treat it?
If you're looking for a needle in the haystack, at least you know you're looking for the needle. When you're looking in the haystack and you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to find it.
Exactly.
And the other thing you said is they're 1/10 of the size. And we just got done with a conversation about the size of the particles and filtering and cleaning the air. Yes. Does the size of these also make them difficult to filter? So even a preemptive measure that is in place to sort of do something more globally, since we don't know what's in that haystack, is that also going to be less effective in this scenario?
I don't know the answer to that. It certainly could be. Of course, I don't know the actual organism as far as its filtration capability. But a swab should be able to pick that up without having to do the filtering. Mm. The thing is, we're not keeping it long enough. We're not giving it the opportunity to say, hey, are you really there?
That's really interesting, Wava. What else is important to know about these small colony variants?
One of the things that some physicians do very well, or diagnosticians do very well, and others don't, is when you have a specimen coming from a patient, you said, I think you've got an infection, but I certainly can't find anything. The comparison of just taking our regular swabbing type sample collections and instead using the ultrasonic capture, putting it in some fluid, putting a cap on it, putting in an ultrasonic cleaner, agitating it then for 3 minutes, you can see almost hundreds of times the number of organisms. You never would have picked up those small colony variants if you hadn't done that.
So you're scared by this, not only because it's hard to discover and it's hard to identify, but also because our testing practices and protocols, in many cases, not all, yes, but in many cases are not even adequate enough to see if there might be something. So once again, in this scenario, you don't even know there's a haystack.
That's right. And as Larry is saying, if we don't start doing these extra things just to check to see what else is there, the other bacteria that start to have small colony variants as well will get right past us, because even if we're just looking for these 8.
Incredible food for thought, Wava. Not that anybody needs another reason to be a little scared of bacteria and bugs, as you sort of adoringly refer to them. Adoringly, because it's been really the nature of your work for so many years. And you're excellent at taking some very technical information and really translating it into a way that you don't have to be a microbiologist to understand the conversation today and the implications. So you really appeal to a wide audience. And I want to thank you for coming on and having this conversation with us today.
No, I appreciate it very much. both to you, Justin, and to Larry.
Pleasure meeting you, Wava. It really was. Thank you for your insights and your wealth of knowledge.
That was Wava Truscott, president of Truscott MedSci Associates, LLC. And Larry, I've known Wava for a while, and I think I mentioned this when we started speaking with her, that she's done a really good job of educating the sterile processing industry around these topics in her area of expertise, which is microbiology. And, I've heard her talk about these different challenges and underreported situations, but her depth of knowledge is just so deep. And I like how she can take that knowledge and really make it digestible regardless of your level of education or knowledge on a specific subject. And at the same time, there are some topics that we covered today that are a little disconcerting, honestly, if you think about the potential for the introduction of new bacteria that's actually old bacteria, and then how prepared we are as an industry. We saw some of that lack of preparation just in the supply chain, even outside of the healthcare industry, but predominantly in the supply chain. But that impacts our ability to react to situations. And you really dove pretty deep into the aerosol kind of conversation and how do we prevent airborne pathogens from presenting a risk in environments that maybe aren't so prepared for them.
Yeah, I think she did a really good job in taking a number of diverse topics and packaging them in a cogent, very organized and simple to understand way. So a couple things. I learned today, for example, that we as professionals really have assignments now, assignments that I didn't necessarily really organize in the fashion that Wava just did. And in terms of, for example, long-term care facilities, we really want to focus moving forward on an evolution of building designs that maybe can better control respiratory viruses that are transmitted by, to your point, the airborne route. And with regard to antibiotics, I think we also need to evolve and kind of reformulate and rethink some of our processes and come up with new antibiotics that destroy the emerging resistance that we're seeing today. We've been talking about that. Everyone talks about that, but it seems as if it has traction, but it's kind of on a treadmill. It's not moving forward. And I think also interesting that while talking about long-term care facilities and antibiotics, we also talked about what would seem to be unrelated, but is not at all. And Wava packaged this very well, that the issue of biofilms forming on instruments and how we also need to evolve in terms of our cleaning technologies and come up with ways to better address and more formidably remove biofilms that form on instruments that otherwise might not be a problem, but because there can be understaffing problems, these instruments maybe are not being pre-cleaned and then more thoroughly brushed as soon as we would like. And so these biofilms are becoming formidable, and we need to come up with automated methods to reduce their adverse impact on the subsequent disinfection and sterilization processes. So some diverse topics all brought together so well, and we now have assignments moving forward to have our own DNA, if you will, adjust and evolve and come up with some better designs and better processes to improve public health.
Yeah, great point, Larry. And I just want to thank Wava again. Great job. I'll just add a quick footnote here. After we recorded this interview, Wava did reach out to us and said that there are now many varieties of effective temporary isolation pods that contain the needed requirements for individual patient isolation without reconstructing rooms and ventilation systems. So this is really an evolving situation, and there will be continued improvements such as isolates like this that are recognized as alternatives or temporary solutions. So that may be another podcast interview for us in the coming weeks and months of the Transmission Control podcast. That's going to do it for this week's show. But as a reminder, you can help support Transmission Control by subscribing for free on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast application. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Larry and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Transmission Control.